The Empire bended almost the entirety of the galaxy to its will, and almost any signs of resistance were completely wiped out. However, this wasn't always the case. Some worlds inevitably were far harder to defeat than others, so what happened if worlds actually defeated the Empire and refused to be assimilated into this superpower? Now, when we're talking about resisting the Empire, that's a pretty broad term. We're talking about worlds that the Empire just couldn't seem to tame, that there would always be some level of resistance. Some because the world's governments were secretly undermining the regime, and although being part of the Empire, were actually working against it. Others outright deployed the military to fight against the Empire and resist the takeover. And others were just where the inhabitants of the world were so resilient and filling up with resistance group that essentially it was a logistical nightmare and the Empire just couldn't effectively operate there. The problem is, eventually a world becomes more effort than it's worth. Say you want a world for its industrial infrastructure, however the government is unmotivated to help you, similarly to Mon Cala, or the civilians are actively fighting you, such as on Jeddah. Eventually it hits a point where committing resources to these worlds, trying to subdue it and bend it into shape, is just not worth it anymore. You're spending more than you will gain. It's not financially viable. So what does the Empire do? Well, they can't just let this happen. Even if they decide that the resources on the world are not actually worth the manpower and time it takes to take control of them, the Empire remains in power largely because of its image. It needs to be strong and scary and imposing. If it allows worlds to fight back and then just lets them get on with their everyday life, even if it is in the best interest of the Empire, it makes them look weak. And once the Empire looks weak, more people will begin to rebel. And that is how empires fall. Ultimately, it needs to maintain its image as the strict superpower. The Empire's method of dealing with resistance is more of a carrot and stick one. However, it's a very small carrot and a very, very big imposing stick. The Empire will likely initially begin a regime of oversight, quietly but effectively working its way into said world's operations. Before anything can be done, it essentially would have to go through Imperial hands, etc. It'll also begin to quickly get rid of problematic individuals, governors and ministers, etc. that don't play well with the Imperials or aren't sympathetic to the cause. In many cases, this is enough to work, as the people in charge are the ones being directly affected. And it's often the best case scenario, as it often leads to the smallest amount of suffering for the most amount of people. However, if the citizens of the world begin fighting back, this is when the campaigns of terror begin. And they go full-on police state. People will be arrested and sentenced without trials, and the ISB and other police groups will begin to terrorise the local populace. This ultimately turns the people complacent with the Empire. It's essentially better to serve under the Empire than to suffer beneath its boot. However, in some cases, this actually has the adverse effect, and it actually only empowers the resistance groups further. If you take so much away, then eventually fighting for what you believe in seems like a good idea, if you've got nothing less to lose. So what happens if a world tries to throw the Imperials off entirely, as they did on Mon Cala, when King Li Cha mobilised his entire army against them, and it erupted into an entire war? Similarly, if these resistance groups get too big and too powerful, that they can actually beat the Imperials in an open fight, which is not easy. This is the point where the Imperials begin to get really destructive. And this is said in the literal sense. They'll begin destroying blocks of cities, factories, and other important assets, such as farms, etc. Now, this isn't something the Empire actually wants to do. All of these assets are ones that the Empire want to control. They're essentially robbing their own pocket by destroying them. However, it's the Imperial mantra that they would rather rule over a destroyed wasteland than have a world resist them. It's more or less, if I can't have it, no one can. And once you take away people's ability to live and survive, then they don't really have a choice but to submit to you. Okay, so in these scenarios, the world has incurred millions of casualties and deaths, and all of their main infrastructure has been wiped out. Now, on 99.9% of cases, this is a victory. Sure, it's not great, but the Empire will slowly rebuild, and the world will probably not dare rise up again. I mean, they'll be telling their children about this for the next considerable amount of generations. But what happens if a world still refuses to yield? If the survivors still fight, then the Empire kinda just goes nuclear. The The world will be blockaded, it'll be removed from star maps, and it's essentially just blacklisted. People will be discouraged from even talking about that planet. It's just like it didn't exist. No one enters and nobody leaves. The Empire will probably send patrols down to ensure that the people aren't rebuilding, and anyone on the planet's surface will be seen as an enemy and shot on sight. The idea behind this is that if the world is in total collapse without any resources, infighting and de-evolution of the citizens begins, and essentially it tears itself apart. Nobody, and I mean nobody, can really be successful in these conditions. The world will also probably be orbitally bombarded just to ensure all infrastructure is destroyed, and the Empire might just hit it with a few experimental weapons just to be sure, as they did on Geonosis. Geonosis is a prime example of the nuclear option. The Empire could not trust the Geonosians to be loyal, and it knew that breaking their morale was basically impossible. They're all linked up to a hive mind, if you will. And, like it or not, the Geonosians were never really going to be loyal Imperials. So they locked the planet down and hit it up with chemical weapons, and boom, it's not really a problem anymore. Not many people were going to Geonosis or talking about it. Ultimately, these worlds are shelved. One day, they may be useful. However, they're quite happy to just let them sit there and devolve into brutal wastelands, devoid of law or civility. More or less, if they do not choose to be part of this great Imperial civilization, then no other civilization can exist. There is only the Empire. There can't be any holdouts. But what do you guys think? How effective was the Empire's way of stopping Resistance Group? And was there a better, more peaceful way of achieving this? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching, I really do hope you enjoyed this video. If so, please remember to like, share and sub, as it's really appreciated and it helps the channel grow. Also, don't forget to follow me on Twitter at TheLawGuy and tick the bell to get regular updates. Thank you again for bearing with me. As I've said in the last few videos, it's a very hectic time at the moment, but I am going to continue to try to get videos out as regularly as possible. But most importantly, thank you so much for watching. I do hope that you enjoyed, and I'll see you next time.